Hey, good morning, everybody. Very nice to see so many of you here. And welcome to CGD's first event of 2016. You'll see I'm Rajesh Mirchandani, the Senior Director of Communications and Policy Outreach. I'm going to be moderating today's event. You'll see on the screens around you, it says Centre for Global Development at 15. That's because 2016 is, in fact, our 15th year of turning ideas into action. And we're going to be staging a host of events, special events, and publications and podcasts and blog posts to celebrate that fact, to reflect on CGD's important contribution to making the world fairer over those first 15 years and looking forward to work that we're doing now and in the future that we hope will see us through the next 15 years and beyond of having the same impact and influence as we have already on global development. So we're really glad that you could all join us for this, our first event in this series. And what a good one to start with, don't you think? Because exactly 1 month ago today, a historic agreement was reached in Paris, whereby countries pledged to reduce emissions in order to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The pledges, as we know, did not amount to enough carbon reduction to reach that point, but it was a start, and hopefully it will lead to more action in the future. Great, everyone celebrated. But what do we do now, exactly? How do we achieve those targets in such a way that makes it easy to exceed them? Because that's what's needed. Not only that, here at CGD, we focus on policies that will help developing countries. So how do you reach carbon targets and help people in poor countries at the same time? That's one of the reasons we've designed this event, Making Paris Happen, carbon markets, taxes, and other policy solutions for climate action. We want to discuss workable policy ideas. One of the things we like to do at CGD is that we produce new knowledge, ideas, and solutions, not just for academic purposes, but they have to have a practical application. So that's really what today is about as well. Let me introduce our panel to you. I'll go down the line like this. Vitor Gaspar is the Director of Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. He's going to tell us about their latest thinking on the role of fiscal and macroeconomic policies in the context of climate action, namely carbon taxes. He'll be sharing with us the details of a new IMF internal discussion paper on that point. Michele de Nevers, a senior associate here at CGD, sitting next to him. She works on climate change. She authored our recent report, Look to the Forests, How Performance Payments Can Slow Climate Change, which laid out clearly how we should reimagine tropical forests as not just wonderful ecosystems and efficient carbon sinks, but also as a utility provider. Tropical forests provide the service of removing carbon. It's something that we should pay for. And they also help forest communities make a living. She'll talk about how rich countries can meet carbon targets, save tropical forests, and help developing countries at the same time. And a copy of that report is in some of the welcome packs that we put out at the front, so please take that at your leisure and read it. Vikram Widge is the head of climate and carbon finance at the World Bank Group. In this role, he's overseen initiatives such as the Pilot Auction Facility, the Partnership for Market Readiness, and the next generation of networked carbon markets. He'll talk about what developing countries are doing in this space and how the World Bank can help them. Catrina Rorke, she's Director of Energy Policy and a Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute. There, she helps promote smart, small government solutions to energy and climate challenges. And in a previous incarnation, she helped her then boss, Republican Representative Bob Inglis, craft the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. She'll discuss the free market implications of carbon taxes and carbon markets. Now, we have an empty chair, as you'll see. That is waiting for Mary Nichols, the chair of the California Air Resources Board. She's hot-footing it here as we speak. She's held that role twice before, in fact, and previously she was also the head of the US EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. So we really want to hear from her. In her career, she's overseen the implementation of strict greenhouse gas emissions laws, air pollution standards for vehicles, acid rain trading programs, and the first air quality standards for fine particles. So it's worth waiting for, as I'm sure you'll agree. She's going to give us a little overview of California's experience with a carbon cap and trade system. The way it's going to work is that each speaker will talk for about 5 or 7 minutes. Speakers, if you've been to any events here at CGD that I've been moderating, you'll know that I am polite but ruthless when it comes to timekeeping. After they've all spoken, then we'll open up to discussion. I'll have some follow-up questions, and then we'll open up to all of you, and I'm hoping you'll all bring excellent questions. So, with that, let's invite Vitor Gaspar, Director of Fiscal Affairs at the IMF. It's great to see you here, Vitor. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about the IMF's latest thinking in this area. How can carbon taxes and other fiscal and macro policies help countries achieve emissions goals and push for more ambitious action? And what role can the IMF play in helping countries do that?
Great to be here. It's a particular pleasure to be here to be associated with the celebration of the 15th anniversary of the Center for Global Development and be part of this first event. I think it's an honor to do so. Thank you for your very kind words of introduction. At the IMF, we welcome the historic Paris Agreement, which offers the hope of meaningful action on climate change. But the critical issue, as you said, is how countries can deliver on their mitigation pledges. This is the focus of a paper that we released today on the IMF website titled After Paris: Fiscal, Macroeconomic and Financial Implications of Climate Change. And we also put out an accompanying blog by Ian Perry, Mick Keane, and myself. The key problem, in our view, is that fossil fuel prices do not reflect true costs of energy use, which include supply costs, global warming, and other environmental costs like that from air pollution. At the fund, we estimate that global energy subsidies, the difference between what consumers pay for energy and its true cost, were $5.3 trillion worldwide in 2015, or 6.5% of global GDP. This is a huge number. It underscores the high stakes involved in getting energy prices right. An important part of this is a charge on carbon emissions from fossil fuels. Carbon pricing has two key advantages. First, it effectively reduces emissions. Charges will result in higher prices for carbon incentive fuels, electricity, and so on. Higher prices will then promote all mitigation opportunity, such as shifting from coal to gas, shifting to renewable energy, driving less, and investing in energy efficiency. Second, carbon pricing generates substantial revenues. For example, a $30 per ton tax in 2010 would have raised revenues of around 1% of GDP or more in many large emitters. This revenue makes room to cut burdensome taxes on work effort and investment, lower debt, help future government liabilities associated with pensions and health, or would help finance socially productive investment. Using revenue in these productive ways helps to offset the drag on the economy from higher energy prices. Our own work suggests that carbon pricing is, in many countries' own interest, due, for example, to fewer air pollution deaths as carbon pricing reduces the use of coal and other polluting fuels. This means that energy price reform that reduces climate change is justified even in terms of narrow national self-interest. At the IMF, we think that the most natural way to price carbon is through taxation. Road fuel excises are well established in most countries. They are among the easiest to administer. So it would be straightforward to include carbon charges in these taxes and apply similar charges to other petroleum products, coal and natural gas. If instead governments use trading systems, we would recommend that they are designed to mimic taxes through allowance auctions to raise revenue and price floors and ceilings. Businesses need robust, predictable emission prices to make major emission-saving investment. Just subsidizing green technologies falls short of what is needed. Right now, about 40 national and over 20 subnational governments have carbon pricing schemes. This is very welcome, but it only scratches the surface. These schemes cover about 12% of global emissions, with prices typically below $10 per ton. Countries need to transition to greater coverage and higher prices if they are serious about their mitigation pledges. International coordination could help this process. For example, carbon price floor arrangements provide some protection against competitiveness impact and allow individual countries the flexibility to set prices higher than the floor. This approach would be analogous, for example, to minimum taxes for excises and value-added tax in the European Union. At the fund, we are playing our role in pushing the climate change agenda forward. First, we stand ready to offer technical assistance on carbon and energy pricing issues to our member countries. For example, we'll be analyzing reform options as part of this year's Article 4 consultations with China. Second, our analytical work offers practical guidance on the design of fiscal policies for climate change. It also quantifies efficient energy taxes for different countries. Third, our outreach agenda routinely brings policymakers and experts together to discuss reforms. For example, at imf.org/environment, you can watch the climate conference we recently held at the annual IMF World Bank meetings. And our participation in this event here today is another prominent example. Let me repeat the punchline to conclude. To follow through on the success of Paris, we need to get energy prices right. And we need to start the process of getting them right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor Gaspar. Michele de Nevers, you've been focusing on climate finance as part of your work here at the Centre, and one area particularly is on tropical forests. The importance of tropical forests not only to climate, but also to development, climate resilience and mitigation. How do these policies matter for forests, but also tell us what forests can do for climate and development as well?
Okay, thank you, Rajesh. Can you hear me? Okay. So as we talk today about the range of policies that Vitor mentioned and the importance of policies for adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, as well as generating funding for the climate finance, we would like to emphasize the importance of looking at policy tools for forests. People, when they talk about policy tools for climate, they usually talk about, as Vitor did, energy, electricity, and those sectors which are important sources of global carbon emissions, but not uniquely so. So I would like to talk about policies as they affect tropical forests. Now, why protect tropical forests? We have a new book coming out in CGD any minute by Francis Seymour and Jonah Bush called Why Forests, Why Now? That will forevermore answer this important question of why forests. But in the meantime, forests are important for development. They have many development benefits, and they're important for climate resilience. But they're also a sometimes overlooked, very important source of climate mitigation. If deforestation were a country, it would be the third largest source of emissions globally, after China and the US, and ahead of Europe. So emissions from deforestation are a very important source. Halting deforestation and regrowing trees on degraded lands together could achieve 30% of the mitigation needed to reduce, to achieve the targets that were agreed and embodied in the Paris Agreement. About 82 countries in their nationally determined contributions included forests and related land use activities in their goals. So forests are important. And what are the key policy tools needed to encourage tropical forest countries to protect their forests? Of course, the most important policy tools are domestic ones within the country. Policies on land use and establishing a border between agricultural land and forests, since agriculture is one of the most important forces for reducing, for deforestation. So domestic policies are important, but domestic policymakers face a lot of pressure to allow for expansion of agriculture into forests, to roads into forests, et cetera. So what the international policy community can do is offer some support to domestic policies for maintaining their forests. Ideally, rich countries would pay tropical forest countries for their performance in the carbon storage services offered by tropical forests, just like we're willing to pay utilities for the electricity they provide. So the good news is that one of the hallmarks of the Paris Agreement is that it endorses performance-based approaches and a performance-based mechanism to protect forests called REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and land and forest degradation, which has been under development for many years and now has really been enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Up until now, payments for REDD, for reducing emissions from deforestation, have come almost entirely from donors as part of their development assistance budgets, principally by the budgets of Norway, Germany, and the UK, and to some extent from other countries as well. So the payment for performance to reduce deforestation from donor budgets has been concentrated, and the donors don't have the resources, they don't have the wherewithal to scale up these performance payments to the scale that would be needed to really provide a significant incentive. So that's where policy tools come in, starting with cap and trade. In cap and trade, firms that have caps can buy emissions reductions that are cheaper from other sources, including internationally, and that was also endorsed in Paris. I'll come to that in a minute. When they do this, forests, international tropical forests, are in fact one of the very cheapest sources of emissions reductions. And so including emissions reductions from international forests in a cap and trade program would be important for lowering the cost of cap and trade and achieving the reduction goals in a less expensive way. Both the importance of forests as a sink and the ability to trade across countries, to buy emissions from other countries, were both included very prominently in the Paris Agreement. Under Article 5, countries are encouraged to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, including forests, and countries are encouraged, this is the language of the UN agreement, may not recognize it, but it says, in cooperative approaches that involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes toward nationally determined contributions. So internationally transferred mitigation outcomes is carbon trading across countries. So stay tuned. I expect we'll hear a lot more about ITMOs. So countries that find it expensive to reduce emissions at home are now encouraged by the Paris Agreement to buy reductions from other countries where they are cheaper. And this is already going on in the few cap and trade programs that are underway, such as the EU emissions trading system, and California has a cap and trade program. Vikram will talk to us about emerging cap and trade programs in developing countries. But of all these various cap and trade programs, only one has the enabling legislation that would allow capped firms potentially to buy emission reductions from tropical forest countries, and that is California, and I'm sure we'll hear about that from Mary Nichols when she gets here. The EU emissions trading system under the Clean Development Mechanism allows countries to pay for, to capped firms to buy reductions from afforestation and reforestation, but not to protect the global sink of trees through reduced deforestation. So we are excited that California has this enabling legislation, and they are on the verge of getting their program for international RED up and running, hopefully this year. And we are hopeful that other cap and trade markets will follow this example. Looking ahead, in the US, under the Clean Power Program, it appears that cap and trade programs, regional cap and trade programs, are being set up all over the US because the legislation allows for trading as a cost-effective way to meet targets. And that has the potential to lead to ultimately a global cap and trade program in the US, which we hope will link with California and include trading that would allow for international forest reductions, emissions reductions. Another area of promise is the International Civil Aviation Organization, Icao, which is the voluntary organization of airline companies. Airlines are an important source of emissions, about 2% of the global total, and there's not that much that they can do to reduce emissions. They have started to focus on it. They have important goals in terms of fuel efficiency, but they recognize that they are not going to be able to reach their self-imposed targets of zero emissions just through efficiency. So they're looking at market-based mechanisms, and they're thinking seriously of including emissions reductions from tropical forests. So we're excited about that, and we hope that that goes ahead. Aside from cap and trade programs, there's one other interesting policy development, which is that in February of 2015, India, as part of its fiscal program, introduced a new part of its fiscal program intended to maintain forests. Every year, India collects taxes from all over the country, and then they give them back to the states in some formula, not necessarily in the same proportion that they came in. They have added a criteria to their fiscal devolution policy that provides a basis of transferring resources based on maintaining forest cover. So far, as a result, about $6 billion a year out of their fiscal program will be allocated to states on the basis of forest cover, providing a very strong incentive for protecting forests in India. So it's an interesting idea that maybe other countries, developing countries, may want to follow, and maybe we'll follow up with Vikram on that. So until now, the main incentive for forest countries to protect their forests has come from payments from donor countries on pay-for-performance programs. While these have been essential programs to show that this kind of mechanism works, we hope that the Paris Agreement lays the groundwork for more support through cap and trade programs and other policy programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Vikram Widge from the World Bank Group. We know the majority of emissions are now coming from developing countries. In fact, my colleague Jonah Bush, who's sitting over there, wrote a blog about this a few months ago. It's in your fun packs, so take a look at that later on. Some of these states, Vikram, have begun to put in place climate policies to shape their development, and the World Bank Group has been active in supporting some of those. Can you talk about what developing countries are doing to set up carbon markets or carbon taxes, and how you're helping them?
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rajesh. I'm very glad to be here and part of CGD's anniversary celebrations. Let me start by agreeing with what Vito said and my IMF colleagues at large, that what we really do need is robust, predictable prices. I think we are totally sort of in agreement that that is key to ultimately reaching the collective ambition and goals that we all want to. And then I'm sure we'll get into the finer points of the discussion and sparring that we both have privately and publicly on taxes versus carbon markets, but that's how we advance the agenda. Let me focus on the market side, since the taxes bit was covered, and then we can come back into a discussion. I think we, amongst many others, are happily surprised to see the extent in which Paris Agreement covered carbon markets. If those of you interested, Article 6, which I think, which is exactly what Michele started to refer to, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, actually is quite expansive in terms of what is it, and it effectively, and maybe this is just my reading, so bear with it, it acknowledges that markets can in fact help countries get onto a low emissions development pathway and hopefully ultimately help them ramp up the ambition that we need to get to from the current path of 2.7 degrees or so the consensus says, based on the nationally determined or intended nationally determined contributions that have been sort of set up to the 1.5 to 2 degrees that is desired or at least set as our ambition. So, clearly the agreement paves the way effectively for a renewed international carbon market. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to sort of start up tomorrow all over again. So that's not the point. The point is it has set it up, but it will look and actually be very different. So Carbon Markets 2.0, before we get there, we're going to do one of these back to the future things where we're going to say, oh my God, this looks like 2002 all over again, when we had the early indications from the Kyoto Protocol under the so-called Clean Development Mechanism. Kyoto hadn't come into force, and everybody was scrambling to figure out what the rules and sort of guidance and governance of these mechanisms would look like. I think we're going to go through that phase, except that we have a huge amount of experience, a lot of procedures and infrastructure in place already, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of jumpstart this next generation of markets much sooner than we managed to do there. And it's going to be very different. I mean, just to sort of recap a couple of things in terms of what the Paris Agreement and the accompanying decision talked about. First, and I'm not even going to go for the full form anymore, ITMOs. Michele did me the favor of introducing them. And if US politics is difficult, global politics is not that difficult, effectively these are carbon credits, right? I mean, they had to find a new phrase for them, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Okay. Generate carbon credits, trade them. But carbon credits are going to have to look very different. I'll get into it in terms of what we think these ITMOs could cover. There is, of course, the recognition and the need to strengthen both transparency and accountability and double counting and all of that. The other key element and related element is the strongly stated support for results-based payments for both RED and forests, as Michele pointed out, but also to implement policy approaches. And I think some of that opens up, for us at least, this bridge between direct market-based emissions trading type of cap and trade approaches to other approaches that may actually take a sort of be fronted emissions reductions through fiscal policy, performance standards, and other sort of policy interventions, which may not necessarily automatically come into what we think of traditionally as cap and trade or the baseline and offset type approaches. And finally, a UNFCCC governed top-down sustainable development mechanism, which also, I guess, is going to take some work, but if anything, that looks or sort of seems like CDM plus or CDM, the next generation of CDM, but it is going to be a top-down, and it is obviously going to sort of also allow for international transfers of emission reductions and their outcomes. So we'll come back to ITMOs because I think, and the policy-related results-based finance, because I think that gets very interesting in terms of trying to implement this. So what does this mean? It means countries, as they have already demonstrated through their INDCs, and I'm told the phrase is still INDCs. It becomes NDCs when Paris Agreement comes into force, hopefully in April. So the lawyers tell me. Okay. So it's still intended till it's ratified and in force. So they, as is consistent with that, they will continue to do it. So where the world is very different from the Kyoto Agreement is this is no longer a top-down approach, Annex 1, Annex 2, here's your target, do what you will. Everybody is sort of doing a homegrown thing here. And which means that they are going to do the same in terms of designing, testing, implementing, whatever carbon pricing approach that best suits their needs, both economically and whatever the political feasibility, political economy in each country is. It could be cap and trade, it could be carbon taxes, it could be regulation, some other fiscal policy, standards, whatever. However, transparency is going to be key. I mean, if you're going to promote accountability and effectiveness in implementation of carbon pricing, then you're going to have to build the confidence in terms of what is it that you have promised to do, your self-appointed targets, and then how are you trying to achieve those. Countries will therefore need to, or at least agree on some sort of an infrastructure that is going to be necessary to compare and ultimately, hopefully, connect and create fungibility across the various, for lack of a better phrase, let me say, carbon assets that these countries are creating. And I'm purposely using that word to sort of distinguish it from whatever we normally think of as carbon credits, which seem to come from allowances and offset type approaches. So from our perspective, from the World Bank Group's perspective, we've been actually helping countries and piloting approaches to deliver innovative climate finance, and then also to help these countries build their capacity in terms of being able to do market-based carbon pricing. And we've been at it for 15 years, and I'm very thankful, as I said in another talk earlier, that management let this institution continue to do that. So we have the Partnership for Market Readiness, which helps, and currently helping 18 countries continue to support and develop both any type of carbon pricing, mainly market-based. It's a platform for a country-to-country exchange, and this is sort of helping get the momentum going. IFC is helping build, like in China, the private sector-related infrastructure for the financial institutions to be able to provide liquidity and risk management. In Paris, we announced something called the Transformative Asset Carbon Facility. It's a 500 million facility supported by 4 donors. And one of its unique features is going to be that it's going to help develop the methodologies and then ultimately help monetize the results from policy-based interventions. This is not going to be just, it's going to support investment-related approaches. We are also going to start to look at policy-based things. And we can talk a little bit more in terms of how this links to fossil fuel subsidy removal and energy efficiency interventions that countries are doing. And I know you're here, so that means I need to stop. But I'll quickly end by saying that in terms of the infrastructure to help create the fungibility and comparability, we have a sort of open source thought leadership platform called the Networked Carbon Markets. And the premise there is the world can do what California and Quebec have done and go through a very intensive legal process to try and link. But at the same time, could we take a somewhat more open approach that relies on ratings and standards and ultimately allows regulators to make decisions, but based on information, much like is available for currencies and economies at large. In fact, think of a carbon reserve, perhaps an IMF for carbon in many ways, that works with domestic carbon central banks, if I can use that analogy, to continue to help provide this robustness and predictability in the pricing. And of course, to account for double counting and all, we're going to need some sort of a special registry or some sort of a transaction sort of tracker, but I'm sure Google and Oracle can deliver that in a couple of weeks. So I'll sort of stop. I think, having said that, I think we are well on our path. Let's not underestimate the challenges of translating what Paris has delivered into actual action. But I think we also are very excited about the fact that this is an opportunity to scale up, move forward, and actually start to mainstream this activity in a plethora of sectors, whether it's energy, transport, forestry, and beyond. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and thank you for your indulgence, Rajesh.
Thank you, Vikram. Nice to know I can rule by fear up here. Catrina, in the introduction, I talked about how you had helped your then Republican Congressman boss draft the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. I want to know more about that. Sounds fascinating, actually. But, our Street Institute has a decidedly libertarian flavor. So in a way, people might be puzzled to see you up on the stage here with everybody else. I'm intrigued to understand how that ethos, that mindset fits with the type of policies we've been discussing, and to hear your thoughts on carbon taxes, carbon markets, cap and trade. Tell us a bit more.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. Yes, I am notably apart from the other people on the stage in that Paris just wasn't that important to me. And I think it's because I don't have a lot of faith that binding international commitments are ever going to do anything. So INDCs, that word intended nationally determined contributions, is so important to me because it sort of reflects this acceptance that we need to move past a problem of free riders and the prisoner's dilemma. No country wants to act first if it considers its economy to be on the line when they're thinking about this intractable problem of climate change that you can't solve on your own. So how do we move past that? The United States, we set up an INDC that we can't meet with existing policies. We're about 30% shy of our INDC, even with the Clean Power Plan, CAFE standards, efficiency standards from the Department of Energy, the attempt by GAO to reduce energy demand, attempts by DOD to reduce energy demand. So even the United States, with this very ambitious president, is falling short. Because that is the case, I think we see that governments are not necessarily the best source for achieving emissions reductions. Actually, fracking has helped us reduce emissions on a trajectory that reflects the trajectory set out by the White House in the Clean Power Plan. Market activity is one of our best sources of emissions reductions, independent of government action on carbon dioxide. So in order to achieve substantial reductions and tackle this problem of climate change, instead of thinking about government solutions, let's think about ways to make reductions part of business as usual. To do that, we need a couple of things. Let's start with the US. So what we want to do is minimize the role of government, libertarian focus, right? Let's get rid of government wherever we can, but then maximize the ways that the government helps the private sector to achieve reductions that are necessary. So minimize the role of government. Don't subsidize damaging activities. We subsidize insurance policies in areas that flood or are affected by hurricanes on a regular basis. So we keep building in areas that are already affected by climate change. That's a terrible financial commitment to make, and it's one that reflects perhaps discontinuous priorities on the part of the federal government. If we care about climate change, let's not subsidize people to be in danger of a changing climate. We can also use the size of government to sure do research and development, but then also to explore how technologies might have practical solutions. So the Department of Defense is a huge buyer of energy. What can they do to pull technologies to market and to do sort of proof of concept, especially when it aligns with mission goals? But the federal government writ large is also a really powerful consumer of energy, and they can be a good platform for testing out some technologies and business models. But then importantly, we don't want our government to pick winners, right? So if fracking has helped us reduce emissions so much, we certainly don't want the government to say, well, this is the ticket, this is the technology solution that's going to get us to reductions. Because we've seen the market prove itself many times without the guidance of government. So instead, we want to clarify market signals. That's a carbon tax. And definitely, it provides that very sort of robust and clear pricing signal, and we can have companies act on that signal in perpetuity without additional government action. It also sort of minimizes the infrastructure needed on the part of government to ensure that carbon is priced. A cap and trade system is a much larger bureaucratic undertaking than a carbon tax. And it's sort of anathema to anybody with libertarian instincts to impose a new sort of government bureaucracy to solve a problem that markets can take care of anyway. And then we also want our government to clarify some things in terms of international trade. So through trade and investment agreements, clarifying through the WTO what a border adjustment might look like, and then standardizing international carbon accounting standards will help our companies to act in international markets in a way that reflects carbon priorities. So those are all things that the government can do to help the private sector act responsibly while acting in their own best interest. So let's turn to the developing world. It's a little bit of a strange problem because if you ask, have fossil fuels created in the developed world a circumstance in which we are much better off, above and beyond the risks of climate change, that answer is definitely yes. Fossil fuels are imperative to our way of life, and they've made us healthier and stronger people for it, right? So we don't have to worry as much about acute harms because of energy. Energy is a really great healthcare system, actually. The developing world needs access to that sort of improvement, right? They're facing the impacts of climate change right now. And because they're facing the impacts of climate change, they need, resources to address a changing climate, but also money. They need to be more wealthy. And encouraging them to reduce emissions at the expense of development might actually be worse. They might actually end up worse off because their commitments to carbon reductions are probably less important than what we can do to help them stay as existing as countries, right? So if Denmark is below sea level and they can build out levees to support a 1,000-year flood, we should equip other countries to do the same. Further, some uncertainties are larger than other uncertainties, which is a really great term. Climate change is definitely happening. It's definitely human-caused, and we definitely want to limit the impacts of it. But we know that development is necessary in order to help those countries deal with that changing climate, right? So which uncertainty are we going to pick? Their economic future or our larger climate future? And let's just be a little bit sort of conscientious about how we're implying countries should participate in global reductions. And then finally, I just want to sort of reiterate this point. If we have government-led solutions, then they're always going to be informed by a political process. That political process is not necessarily scientific. So what we want to see is establishment of market trends and market incentives that will help the private sector to achieve reductions that aren't necessarily tied to specific quantitative outcomes, but get us on the right trajectory. And as we increase our certainty in the science, as we increase our certainty in how business models are reshaping around this climate confidence, then we can continue to act and promote greater reductions, but let's be sort of cautious of expanding the size of government to do so and see what the markets can do for us independently. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Catrina. I have a feeling there may be some questions for you later on in the section. We're still waiting on Mary Nichols. Let me just recap a couple of points. I noted down a few numbers that people on the panel came up with, a couple of interesting points that you might just want to keep in mind. So Vito was telling us that global energy subsidies amounted to $5.3 trillion in 2014. 15, sorry. Oh yeah, we're in 16 now, aren't we? Yeah. And that's 64% of global GDP. No, 6.4%, 6.5% of global GDP. That's an awful lot of money, isn't it? Michele was telling us about the mitigation potential of tropical forests. Forest deforestation creates about 10% of emissions, but can mitigate up to 30% of emissions by stopping chopping down the trees and allowing those forests to grow back again. Vikram talked about, and I might ask you to explain a little bit about this later on, a $500 million transfer facility that you guys had announced in Paris, and also mooted the idea of an IMF for carbon. I'd like to put some flesh on those bones. I'm sure Vito might have some things to talk about there as well. Catrina lobbed a grenade into the room, which is great. But also talked about how the US is 30% short on its own INDC. It's individually, what was it? Intended national...
Determined contribution.
That, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great to have another acronym. So interesting numbers, interesting ideas. While we're waiting for Mary Nichols to join us, let's kick off the discussion. Vito, let me start with you, actually. What are the first things that developing countries need to do to implement effective carbon taxes, and how can you guys help? And it'd be great to get some more ideas from the rest of you on this once Vito's answered.
So I saw in this panel a tremendous amount of commonality when it comes to the use of the price mechanism, this fundamental idea of getting energy prices right. And the reason why that is so fundamental is because that's the only way to provide incentives for the private sector to contribute to mitigation along all relevant margins of substitution of dirtier to cleaner sources of energy. The key aspect that I did not have time to elaborate in my introductory remark is actually endogenous technological change, right? In order for firms, in order for innovators to have the proper incentives to invest in new technologies, one needs to have the price of energy right, and one needs the price path to be reasonably predictable, because investment does require a certain amount of certainty. When you try to apply these principles to developing countries, the same general principles apply, but one has to be very careful about the specific recommendations that one is giving. For example, the issue of being able to protect the poorer segments of the population, the most vulnerable segments of the population, is in many practical instances a very important aspect, as is the capacity that countries have to implement the various schemes. And from that viewpoint, simplicity, which is always a very important feature, is particularly important in developing countries. So when the fund goes to a developing country and advises on the way to design its energy policy, its tax system to tackle issues of external effects associated with energy uses, the various specific circumstances of the country, including the ones that I mentioned, have absolutely to be taken into account.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Echo or challenge or pick up on a point? No, it looks like you met with consensus there. Vikram, you look like you're bristling to say something.
Yeah, I guess in terms of just the commentary now and earlier, taxes, of course, present definitely the signal that we need. I mean, we're all agreed that carbon pricing is going to be critical. But if I can just be partly provocative, as I was with my IMF for carbon comment, and we can explore that further in a separate sort of discussion. But and I was hoping Mary Nichols would be here to some extent to come support what I'm trying to articulate, given that she's one of the bigger proponents. She's running an emissions trading scheme. But carbon taxes don't come without any infrastructure need, right? I mean, the thing that, cap and trade requires this, yes, there is an initial investment in cap and trade. But carbon taxes do require government, like any taxation program does. There was a reference to WTO. Which country is going to do? We're not going to have one uniform price on carbon globally. There are economists who argue that's the way to do it. General consensus, or there's no consensus, sorry. A lot of people I speak with, and the economists say that you can't have a single price of carbon globally. So if you're not going to have a single price on carbon, then we are not going to have a single level of taxation on carbon, at which point you are going to rely on a fairly big bureaucracy known as the WTO to do some sort of tax adjustments or whatever it is that you're going to do. So I wouldn't sort of just say, I think taxes are very appropriate in certain sectors where even economy-wide taxes are great, but they have to be supplemented in certain key sectors with other mechanisms. And that's where I'll sort of leave it for now, and we can explore that further. But let's not dismiss one versus the other based on the fact that, one doesn't require government intervention or is light and the other requires much more. Because if you're looking at how you're going to utilize the revenue, how you're going to redirect it to low carbon investment, whether endogenous or external flows, there is $80+ trillion in savings globally through pension funds. How are you going to help unlock that? Yes, pricing is a great and important aspect to that. The investors themselves are asking for it. But how do you ultimately start to move that in or help move that around the world into places where it's needed most? I think we're going to need a toolkit. We're not going to be able to get away with, nothing's going to be a panacea for this thing. Sure.
So I agree, and I think that we need to be careful about considering what the purpose of a cap and trade or carbon tax might be, and sort of this international cooperation to, let's say, achieve positive forestry outcomes, or mobilize capital towards things that can't quite be captured in one country's cap and trade or carbon tax. So I prefer a carbon tax because it's a lighter bureaucratic touch, but also because if designed properly, countries can move on a carbon tax without worrying about developing a competitive disadvantage versus their partners. So depending on how they move the revenue back into the country and what the outcome of any sort of border carbon adjustment litigation might be at the WTO, carbon tax is sort of a policy in isolation. So I think about that as being more like a domestic energy policy outcome than a global climate outcome. So then we'll need the other tools to move on things that we prioritize as an international community, but we want to preserve the ability of countries to make sort of solitary decisions on how they act domestically. And that's why I think a carbon tax is a really great tool for them.
May I make 3 quick points on Vikram? So I think that by and large we agree, so this is a relatively minor thing. But in terms of design, a carbon tax is one of the easiest taxes to design because it can be based on fuel excises, and the administration of fuel excises is very easy. The second is I would definitely not necessarily jump to a solution involving border correction, precisely because I see that as very much potentially a very difficult route to follow at the global level. And thirdly, I very much agree with the point that you have made, Catrina, that when it comes to competitiveness, if one uses the revenue from the carbon tax to reduce, say, taxes on labor or corporate income taxes, the impact on competitiveness actually becomes ambiguous for a country acting on its own. And so it's relatively simple and conceivable to make. But those are relatively minor and second-order qualifications to what you said, Vikram.
Yeah, I have a question for actually maybe both of you, which is when we talk about
Hello,
carbon.
Michelle.
Oh,
I think Mary Nichols has just joined
Never
us.
mind.
Welcome,
yes.
Mary.
Oh,
It's great
sorry.
to see you.
Welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
So Mary, why don't you get settled in, have a listen to what's being said. Michelle, you carry on with your question, and then Mary, once we've had a couple of responses to this question, maybe we'll come to you and invite you to speak. Great. Thank you very much for hot-footing it over here, Michelle.
And actually, it's great. Mary's timing is perfect because my question is relevant to what's going on in California. We're talking about sort of the relative merits of a carbon tax versus a cap and trade system. And when people talk about carbon taxes and the ease of administration, because you can put excise taxes on energy and fossil fuels and that sort of thing, it's not clear to me what the implication of that would be for forests. It's not clear to me how a carbon tax would provide an incentive for a tropical forest country to protect its forests. And it's not clear to me how the revenue from that would be able to provide an incentive, be transferred to tropical forest countries in a way that you have with cap and trade through international forest offsets, which California is pioneering in the world and will be the first place to do it, and the rest of the world will hopefully quickly follow on behind them. So that's the question I wanted to put out, but maybe we could hear from Mary about how California is going to work and then come back to this question. Is that all right?
Should I talk a little bit about the cap and trade program then and how that works? Okay. Well, this is an interesting question. I just came from a class at Georgetown that I'm teaching where that was the last question of the day, and it was asked of me and also my guest and friend, Greg Dotson, who worked on the Waxman-Markey legislation and obviously has a strong view on the merits of cap and trade. So I'm probably more agnostic than most people are about which is the right mechanism. I mean, to me, the most important issue is putting a price on carbon. I think that is clearly where we are now and what we've got to get to no matter what. We chose the cap and trade mechanism in California, frankly, because we could do it. It was something that administratively could be done that did not require the legislature to enact it, as they would have had a tax. They had given the Resources Board the power to create a program to meet the legislative mandate to achieve 1990 emissions levels by 2020 and gave us a choice of tools. But adopting a tax is not something that an administrative agency could have done on its own. So really the only choices were regulation, a more direct kind of source by source or industry by industry regulation, of which we are doing a lot, by the way, or a cap and trade program. So we would have had to ratchet up the regulatory system even more, or we could do a cap and trade program. So that was rather an obvious choice. And it was also something that the governor, at that point, Governor Schwarzenegger, was very committed to. He had signed the legislation with a proviso that he intended to adopt a cap and trade program. So again, the political will was there to do that program. But since that time, having had the opportunity to actually work in the trenches designing the program and then implementing it now for these past several years, I have come to be a fan of it, primarily because once it's in place, it's sort of self-executing, and it's not very difficult to enforce. We've had our first compliance period. We set this up with quarterly allowance auctions, and every year there's a true-up where the covered entities have to show that they have at least 1/3, or in the second year, 2/3 of the allowances that they need to cover their emissions during that period. But the actual enforceable requirement is a 3-year period, a 3-year compliance period. So we've passed our first actual compliance period, and we did it with a compliance rate of 99.99%. It took a lot of work, I would say, in the last days, because there were a few of the smaller entities that hadn't quite understood what their requirements were, and some effort was needed on the part of staff to pull them into compliance. But overall, most of the entities that are covered by this program understood their obligations and were managing them extremely well at this point. So it has achieved the desired results in terms of emissions reductions. We know we've got those results because we have audited, verified emissions data. And incidentally, we also now, because we are auctioning 10% of the allowances in every compliance period, we've achieved a considerable amount of revenue for the state of California, which is now being put to work in a variety of different programs that are out there in communities, helping to fund programs that reduce energy use and are turning over the fleet and are visible and therefore now popular with the legislature as well. So it has achieved all of those good results. Could we have gotten there with a tax? Yes, I think we could. And in some ways, I would say there would be some issues that we face now, particularly the question of how to make sure that the revenues are spent in ways that actually further the emissions reduction goals of the program, which is required because of under the cap and trade program. This is a fee, and therefore any revenue that you achieve from the sale of the allowances has to be plowed back into programs that actually address the underlying cause of climate change. From my point of view, of course, that's how you'd like to see the money spent, but the reality is once you go into the legislative appropriation process, people have a lot of ideas about how they'd like to spend the money and a lot of different priorities. And it's very difficult to restrain that, especially in an atmosphere where there are not a lot of sources of other new revenue coming in. I don't begrudge them that sentiment. I might well feel the same way, but it has made it very difficult every year to go through the arm wrestling process between the executive and the legislative branch, and we're still actually in court as well with the Chamber of Commerce, which questions whether we're actually doing this as a fee at all, whether we have the power to do it.
Mary,
I hope that answered the question.
Very much so, but a couple of pickups quickly, and then we'll open up to questions and return to Michelle's question. You talked about a very high compliance rate, 99.96%.
Yes, right.
Extraordinary.
We had 2 companies, very small companies, that had to pay a penalty. They had not, in fact, gotten all their allowances.
How did you get to that high compliance rate? How did you police the system? How did you make it catch on?
Well, we started off with a very heavy educational program before we ever began the cap and trade program. You know, AB 32, the California Global Warming Solutions Act, was passed and signed at the end of 2006. The cap and trade program actually went into effect in 2010. And during that entire period, we were doing some of the developmental work, going through the administrative law process, but also holding lots of workshops. We had a practice auction. We actually did one full auction that allowed people to test the system to see if they could do it. We also delayed the start of the program twice because I was convinced that we weren't quite sure that we would be able to bring off the first auctions without difficulties, and we just couldn't take that risk. It had to be perfect. We had a market monitor that's hired as part of the program, an independent third-party entity that reviews the auctions, which are done in secret. Then literally, I can't go in the room while the auction is going on, and there's no communication happening, but after the fact, the market monitor reviews the bids to see if there's any signs of collusion. We don't control the third-party market, so there is a market out there. It's not terribly active or exciting, and frankly, that's one of the reasons why this program has worked so well from an emissions control program, is that most of the entities that are required to have allowances are able to get the allowances that they need, and so there's not a lot of excess sloshing around in the system for traders to be playing around with. Now, that obviously was a disappointment to people who were envisioning a whole new exciting market in California climate allowances. That really has not materialized. There's a small market there, just like there's a small offset market, but that's it.
What about linking up with other cap and trade markets in other parts of the world, and also ones that are being set up across the US under the Clean Power Act?
We are formally linked with the province of Quebec. We in Quebec actually run joint auctions, and allowances that are issued under Quebec's cap and trade program are fully equivalent to fungible with California allowances. We have not been able to do that with any other jurisdiction. We haven't even come close to trying because the barriers to doing it are very substantial. Under California law, the governor and the attorney general both have to certify that any entity that we link with has a system which is fully compliant with California. And so their rules have to be as stringent, their enforcement program has to be as good. We have to be able to send inspectors into their jurisdiction, and they have to be able to send them to ours. And there were a lot of details to be worked out, especially, I mean, we couldn't have picked a more difficult partner if you're looking in the North American continent, in the sense that in Quebec, everything has to be done in 2 languages. So all of our activities are done in both French and English, and we have 2 currencies. And so at the time of settlement, you decide which currency is going to prevail for the settlement of the allowances. So it is complicated, and the fact that it's been able to be done without a hitch or a scandal, I think really is a major achievement. But it's not the kind of thing that rises to the level that most people are going to be aware of, which is exactly what's good about it, is that it's basically invisible. Could we do this with other jurisdictions? We've talked about it, and we've had some conversations. We're currently talking with New York. From time to time, we've talked with Reggie. We have other Western states that were part of the development of our cap and trade program. But for various reasons, all of them have had difficulties really coming forward with a full program that's as comprehensive as California. So as we look at linkage in the future, we're thinking about sort of other forms of linkage, like maybe just with power plants, or recognizing offsets from other jurisdictions and that sort of thing, as opposed to the full partnership that we have with Quebec.
Okay, well, we thank you for hot-footing it here and launching straight into that straight away. Thank you. Have a little breather. Before we go to questions from the audience, let's consider the question that Michele had posed. We focus a lot on tropical forest preservation. Which is a better mechanism for providing an incentive for developing countries to protect forests, cap and trade or carbon tax? What are your thoughts on these, panel? Vito.
If I can go first, from a theoretical viewpoint, it shouldn't make a difference. Because once you have decided what the price of carbon is, if forests reduce carbon emissions or the level of the carbon stock in the atmosphere, it's just a negative number, right? And in theory, we multiply by negative numbers as easily as we multiply by positive numbers. But as you very well know, there is a very important theorem that says that in theory and practice are equivalent, but that does not apply in practice. So you have to think through the details quite carefully. But if you think about the details that are going to matter, they have to do with things like, when you assess carbon reductions, what is the counterfactual that you're going to use for the computation? In case you have different carbon prices around the world, because the cap and trade schemes are not unified or because the carbon tax is not the same, then you have to decide what is the price that actually applies. But it does seem to me that the practical difficulties are basically the same for taxation, cap and trade.
Yeah, so I guess it's a question of what you choose to include in your program. If you include offsets under a carbon tax or a cap and trade, then those offsets can go to forestry. But I'm hesitant to suggest that that's a positive thing. If we're creating a carbon tax or a cap and trade system or any really pricing system for emissions related to energy use, that is an energy program. And yes, it has environmental outcomes. Yes, it bears relevance in the climate change discussion. But is that the best tool for us to engage in this international effort to reduce deforestation and promote healthy forests? I'm not convinced that that we want to include climate change writ large within a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme, largely because my preferred policy, a carbon tax, would have a lot of difficulty addressing other components of climate change. And it falls short in things like refrigerants, right, which are really potent greenhouse gases. And the price for those under a carbon tax is just absolutely mind-boggling. So I see no reason to not select multiple pathways to achieve desired outcomes under a climate change activity scenario because of the ways that singular policies fall short in crossing boundaries.
Okay, let's open up to some questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time left. There are a couple of people with microphones. I'll take a couple of questions at once. What I'd like you to do is stand up, tell us your name, where you're from, and go forth with your question. And I would urge you to keep it a succinct question as opposed to a statement.
Okay.
Gentleman there first, and lady on the edge there.
Peter Samuel, Capital Intel. My question is mainly for the World Bank IMF, and it reflects California. It's about the market distortion on government subsidies for renewable energy in the developed world, United States and Europe, where we've seen some very damaging things. It's taking assets away from the developing world like Africa, where renewable energy, solar, wind, or even hydro is both sustainable and profitable. And we're seeing now a energy crisis in Germany where we have an increased pollution, acid rain, and an energy crisis that looks like a repeat of California when it had its own energy crisis. And we've seen the economic impact that it had in California, shifting GDP to other states like Texas and other places. And as IMF, World Bank, will you be using that as a G20, G7 to get countries like the US and EU to stop subsidizing energy and putting that money back into those focus where renewable energy does have a visible and empirical effect, and you can see the returns? Thank you.
And then there's a lady here. Yeah.
Hi, this question is for Mary Nichols. I'm Elizabeth Harbaugh. I'm with Environment and Energy Publishing. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about your discussion with New York I know New York is part of RGGI. RGGI is working with, is thinking about how it might work under the Clean Power Plan. How do all those moving parts fit together?
What is RGGI, by the way?
That's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's a Northeastern cap and trade program.
In case people didn't know. Do you want to answer that first question?
Sure. Just really quickly. We've had very preliminary conversations through the governor's office and with the RGGI states about these issues. And I don't think that there's any inclination on their part to go to an economy-wide cap and trade program at this point. And we're not inclined to do just a power plant program. So we will have to explore whether there are other ways that we could link, but it would not be the kind of full linkage that most people have thought about unless we make some changes in our programs. But you know, the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan is providing a real strong push for all states to look separately at their electricity systems, including ours. And so we are looking at whether there are ways that our power producers would benefit or might benefit from some more direct form of linkage. But this is very exploratory at this point.
And then Vikram and Vito, do you want to consider the first point the gentleman was making about the market distortion of government subsidies on renewables or on fossil fuels? On renewables, yeah. And would you be trying to get G7, G20 to get rid of those?
Okay, the answer to that is very clear. As I emphasized, and I hope it came loud and clear in my presentation, when we plea for carbon taxes, we're basically saying that that is the best market mechanism compatible way of providing incentives to mitigation efforts across the full spectrum of possibilities that the private sector may consider. And from that viewpoint, the benefit of carbon tax is that it could replace quite a substantial amount of subsidies and regulations, thereby making the system of incentives to fight climate change much simpler and much easier to coordinate internationally.
One thing I'd add to that is that if you look at fossil fuel, if you look at subsidies on energy at large, and my numbers may be off or sort of dated, but colleagues from IMF can correct it. If I remember right, the number is about $550, $600 billion a year in subsidy, of which about 80 billion goes to renewables, or relatively, whereas the rest goes to fossil fuel subsidies. So if you look at it in that context, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Vito that we need to see if we move to some sort of a mechanism that sends the price signal through the economy, everything will start to adjust. But we have to, before I started to sort of lobby for rolling back on subsidies for renewables, I think we have to equivalently talk about the fossil fuel subsidy removal, which of course is a very active part of the broader G20 agenda, which of course the IMF and World Bank group at large support. So there's no doubt about it, but the question is, where do the priorities lie in that sequencing? And so, yes.
I think a couple of countries, Indonesia and India, taken advantage of low oil prices to roll back.
Many others.
Exactly.
It's
Still
actually
a
more
couple
than
more.
20 countries.
It's a great time
Oh, right.
to do that.
Still a couple more questions. Michelle, who are you pointing me to?
Michael, sorry.
Oh, there you are. And then let's get Michael, and then let's get lady in the corner over there. Great.
Wonderful. Michael Wallison with Climate Advisors. As we frame this as coming out of Paris and some implications of the Paris decision, I'd like to come back to that god-awful acronym of ITMOs, and starting with the last two letters, mitigation obligation. If we recall the Paris framework, the bottom-up notion of Paris, the INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, many countries, especially developing countries, actually put forward commitments in several different modes, including both targets that were regardless of whether they had any support, as well as conditional targets that were that they would commit to reaching if the appropriate levels of finance were there. So when you start with the mitigation obligations and what those obligations mean, what does that O actually mean when there's a conditional commitment? There is a bridge that I see between the conversation about ITMOs, how you transfer those mitigation obligations, and the finance discussion. And if the facile decision that ITMOs means carbon credits is a slippery slope that we all take, I think it's a bit too facile right now until we have thought a little bit about what those conditional commitments mean and what the ties to the finance commitments that have been made also by the developed countries. We have to consider those as obligations as well. And to the extent that international finance is an obligation to achieve mitigation in other countries, that needs to be part of the ITMO conversation as well. And it's not just a conversation about credit swaps or actually credit trading. So my question, as I was directed to make sure I had and not filibuster, is really how does the ITMO conversation address conditional commitments and finance? How do we wrap that up together? And Vikram, I'd love to hear your thoughts looking forward, which I think you recognize as a bit of a knotty problem, but I'd love to hear how we do that.
Okay, let's get a question from the lady against the wall of it.
Hi, my name is Rosanna Marie Neal, and I'm with the Sustainable World Initiative. My question is for Catrina. You presented, the dilemma of our climate future versus the economic future of developing countries. I'm from a developing country. I'm from Jamaica, and my father is a farmer. He retired a few years ago from a corporation. Sorry, there's some feedback here, and he's been planting fruit trees for a number of years, and he comes from a line of farmers. His father was one, his grandfather was a farmer as well. And because of a historic drought that we have experienced in Jamaica, all of his crops are now dead. Plants that have been around for over a decade, they died because of the extent of the drought. And we all clearly believe that it has something to do with climate change. And so my question to you is, can you please elaborate on how having a more industrialized economy, stronger economy, is a worthwhile trade-off? It's a viable substitute for having a local source of food and water. Thank you.
Okay. Katrina, you want to take that question straight away?
Yeah, it seems like I can make some missteps in answering this, so please accept some maybe too casual language. So I don't think that we're talking about trade-offs. I think it's something that we talk about a lot, the trade-off between environmental and economic quality, particularly Republicans, who I guess I'm partially representing on this panel, Republicans in the United States. So what we want to do is make sure that we're not preferencing aggressive commitment to reducing greenhouse gases over a commitment to create infrastructure and wealth in countries to be able to deal with the consequences of a changing climate. We know that the United States is able to deal with the consequences of climate change because of the government infrastructure enabled by our wealth. So we subsidize farmers when they suffer drought in the United States, and we can do that because we have the revenues for it. Creating more developed economies creates more stable economies that are better able to weather the coming storm, pardon the pun, of climate change. So what we want to do is emphasize a sort of delicate balance. How do we create the tools to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, give access to efficiency technologies, give access to alternative energy technologies, without necessarily creating an obligation to preference those reductions over needed economic development. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. Just, you talked about representing the Republican point of view on the panel. I want to point out CGD is a bipartisan organisation. We can't speculate about the preferences of other members of the panel. But your organisation is perhaps the one that see the most obvious political leanings. Okay, thanks for pointing. Let's clarify that. Vikram,
Okay.
The question from Michael Wallison to you was, what does the O in ITMO mean?
Actually, it means outcomes, not obligation, but that's okay. I think I can still make the connection because What the point you're trying to make, I think, is valid. It's not only going to be a knotty problem, but how do ITMOs? So two things about ITMOs is going to be these are based on voluntary cooperation between countries. So I think that's important to note that they can, in many ways, and ultimately it won't just be bilateral. It won't just be two countries or jurisdictions talking about it. They could, but as this grows, there's going to have to be some level of convergence in order to allow for more mobility of money and fungibility. So to answer your specific question, the mitigation outcomes, because they're based on voluntary sort of discussions or whatever you want to call it, cooperation between two countries, can start to address the bilateral or the sort of bi-level issue which you refer to in the NDCs, which is, this is what I'm going to do on my own, and if I had more money, I could do this much more. Now money can be transferred in many ways, but one possible way of doing that could be through ITMOs, where people have two jurisdictions or more than two have a shared sort of vested interest in the outcomes. And so and I also agree with you that yes, we're being a little facile and saying, oh, this is the international sort of negotiators' way of calling carbon credits by a new name, which is why I think we have to look at carbon asset, call it emission reduction assets to be truly there. It can take any form. ITMOs can come out of policy. They don't have to come from cap and trade. They can come from fossil fuel subsidy removal revenues being actually redirected to energy efficiency performance standards or anything else. However, if the host country has ownership of that, it can then decide how much of it wants to use for its own base commitment, and perhaps how much what it can trade or sell, so to speak, in a bilateral or a plurilateral arrangement with another organization. I think it forms the basis of what is being talked about and will probably emerge in the next couple of years. I'm fairly confident this whole issue around carbon clubs, where groups of countries, and that's what I meant by a plurilateral approach, groups of countries will get together. They could be developing, they could be developed. Everybody has their own INDC, and there will be some level of exchange of these ITMOs. And a secondary discussion, which I won't get into right now, is how are you going to compare these? How are you going to look at the mitigation outcomes? How are you going to compare them? How are you going to value them so that they can actually be priced and traded? And I think that's a separate discussion we can have offline, or if somebody else asks a question, I can answer that.
So the $5 billion that the UK, Germany, and Norway pledged for forests at Paris, that's basically an ITMO, isn't it?
Well, Michelle's going to have to help me here, but it's not an ITMO yet. It is effectively a pool of money that says, if there are results, we'll pay for them. Defining those results and outcomes could be an ITMO. I think the challenging thing about policies, unlike normal sort of cap and trade, is going to be, how do you actually create a methodology around a policy intervention? We know it's going to have greenhouse gas emission reductions, but how do you actually create a methodology that can monitor and validate that outcome so that when the policy goes into place and transitions into results, these can actually be monitored and reported and therefore are validated and ultimately paid for. So I think this $5 billion is a pool available for that, but there's a whole process I think we need to go to actually translate it into payments for ITMOs.
Well, you should read Michelle's report. It has all the answers in it.
Of course.
Right.
That's what I look for.
Except it was written before ITMOs. But the $5 billion does not just cover outcomes. It doesn't just cover performance and results. It also covers a lot of inputs that would be needed to go in to create those outcomes.
Okay. Mary.
I was just going to defend subsidies, which is always unpopular. But
The outlier on the panel.
I think it's important to say that when we began our cap and trade program, probably the largest area of controversy was about the offset program. And it wasn't just about additionality or enforceability. It was also about whether money that was generated under this program would be used in ways that directly benefited California. And we could not have launched it if people hadn't been willing to see that there were going to be projects and programs coming forward as part of our commitment on dealing with greenhouse gases that would generate investment and jobs in California, and it has. It's a series of policies. It's not just the cap and trade program. There's a renewable portfolio standard, a low carbon fuel standard, and other things that have forced action to happen essentially on the ground in California. But now that people are sort of more secure about how this program is working and see the benefits of it, I think it's not impossible that our California legislature, as some other subnational governments have done, would be willing to directly authorize contribution, even of California resources towards an international forestry program, because they understand the need to address the problem. It's not that they're not aware of the fact that we don't get to stop global warming just by things we do in the state of California, but they'd be more likely to step out in terms of partnership with the private sector on a global scale than to jigger around with the credit schemes under the California program. I think it just it's perhaps human nature that we want to control what we can control, within our own system. But also, once we can see that we're making progress, everyone is more willing to do that. And the reason to do it, in large part, is because these INDCs, as we all have acknowledged, are not enough to get us to 2 degrees, much less 1.5. So if we're going to ratchet up the level of ambition, getting more money into the system has got to be the way to do it.
Vito.
One very quick add-on. The argument that you used, Mary, that it's absolutely crucial when one is pricing energy right to discuss how the additional revenue generated is going to be spent,
yes,
is absolutely central.
Right.
This does not make sense unless this aspect of revenues, expenditures, or revenues, compensating revenues is discussed explicitly. When you take the national viewpoint, and when one is thinking about the competitiveness of countries, using the revenues generated, say, by a carbon tax to reduce labor taxes or corporate income taxes is particularly attractive. I just wanted to give this example because I believe it's a very relevant example in many practical implications.
Okay. We're a few minutes after 1, but if one person has one killer question, I'm happy to take it. Are you sure it's a killer question? Are you sure? Okay, go for it. This gentleman at the front. Here's the microphone coming to you, sir. No pressure.
Terry Hill with the Passive House Institute. What role in mitigation will retrofitting existing infrastructure like buildings play in the whole discussion?
We'd like to take that question on.
The governor last year signed legislation that calls for a 50% improvement in the energy use in existing buildings in California by 2030. And it's a huge undertaking to do that. There has been for a long time, there have been a suite of policies that were designed to encourage utilities and to enable them to make money by investing in efficiency and greater efficiency and for their customers, but they've stalled at a certain level, I would say, and we're going to need a whole new level of information and marketing and tools to actually get to those results. But when we do, we see tremendous benefits from it.
Michele, isn't it? The point is also, though, that if developed countries want to reach their emissions reductions targets, it's much cheaper to do it by reducing deforestation in tropical countries than by doing things like making buildings more energy efficient.
Well, it depends. I mean, energy efficiency is one of those things that actually is usually profitable. It has a negative cost. There are other barriers to why people don't do it. But there are, it may involve some cost and it may be cheaper. But if you have a standard that says you have to have 50% reduction, that's not tradable with trees in tropical countries. But if you have an allowance or an emission reduction cap, then you can trade that.
So I'd also add to that, it's retrofitting fine, but I think if you look at the developing world, my sort of built environment and urban people and all our building specialists tell us that most of the urban environment that is going to exist in 2050 in emerging markets hasn't even been built yet. So I think that particular sector, if you call it the building sector, if you will, is huge in terms of what we can do even in the new build as it goes out. So that's where I think a lot of the regulation and performance standards are going to play a huge role in terms of a ground-up exercise, starting from municipal building codes all the way to getting financiers and mortgage providers and ultimately the entire financial system geared towards, even in terms of how it's going to deal with that sector. So
Okay, we're probably going to have to leave it there, I think. Did you have a quick point to make, Katrina?
Yeah,
30 seconds.
not speaking for any particular party, of course. I think we've heard, we need regulations to promote efficiency. I just want to say this is why it's so important to get the price right. If the price is right, we'll build for efficiency. You don't need any sort of bureaucratic process or standard to do so.
Yes.
Can we retrofit the new Trump Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue? Okay. Another conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been great to have you here joining us for our first event of 2016 and the first event of what is our 15th anniversary year. For those of you who joined us late, you're going to see this slogan around a lot more on all our events this year to celebrate 15 years of turning ideas into action. I'm very happy to say that we kicked off with a great gender balance event on our panel as well. We're going to try and do that more. Hold our feet to the fire, and please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.